I'm very happy to have you again, Professor Tyson. And this time we're going to talk about the biblical kingdoms, the kingdom of Judah and kingdom of Israel, and their relations with the local states and
hmm
regional powers. What we know about kingdom of Judah and kingdom of Israel, because they were often also rival states, and they had very complicated relations with Egypt's Mesopotamian powers, Ammonite kingdom, Edomite kingdom, and Moabite kingdom.
Indeed. A lot to be said there. I guess if maybe would start with, you know, the the origins of Israel and Judah. As far as we can tell, of course, we have biblical texts that identify, have stories about the origins of Israel and Judah, and then mentioned uh, a few Jordan River. Have followed then, and his area of what would area, and so it's sometimes hard to know what the reality is on the ground based on these stories, in part because both Saul and David, at least, seem to have been more like kind of roaming warlords, and they did not leave a significant amount of architecture in their wake. So it's not until maybe Solomon, but most scholars now think later that we get, archaeological significant archaeological evidence, let's put it that way, of something that we would call a state, with monumental architecture, writing, etc. Now, let me just make a distinction here. You can have a kingdom with a person who calls himself king without having monumental architecture and um, writing and these other things. So it's entirely possible that there was a king of Israel, a king of Judah, or united monarchy under David, without, and him calling himself a king without having, a huge city or these kinds of things. But it's really once we get down to the ninth century for the northern kingdom, Israel, especially under the Omrides, King Omri of Israel being the first of that dynasty, that we get significant architectural remnants of a kingdom. And this is in particular found at sites like Megiddo and Jezreel. And it's really with Israel, again, in the north in the ninth century, its interactions with Mesopotamia. We have with Moab, and in particular also Damascus. So Israel has, if you want to think about it, or topographically, what they have access to, they have access to more water. Generally speaking, the north gets more rain. The Jezreel Valley is particularly productive in terms of food, and also access to trade pathways that go more easily out to the coast. So really see kingship in its full form, I guess, if you want to put it, for lack of better terms, develop earlier. That is in the 9th century in Israel, the Northern Kingdom. And it's there where you get the initial conflicts with the Assyrians. So there's this famous Battle of Karkar in 853. Shalmaneser III meets a coalition of people from the Levant, including Ahab of Israel, who brings a whole bunch of troops and chariots. That we get, that's when we get the first mention of people from Israel. And then, of course, as I'm sure you're aware, also you have the Tel Dan stele, also from the second half of the 9th century, indicating a war or conflict with Damascus. And then, of course, in the second half of the 9th century, you have the Moabite stele or Mesha stele, which was found in Tiban, and has this whole story about Mesha, who's also mentioned in the Bible, rebelling against the Omrides and taking back some territory or capturing territory from the Omrides. So you get in that 9th century, you get a lot of indication of conflict, but it's mostly with the Northern Kingdom and its neighbors. Also, Hazael of Damascus in the late 9th century is a very powerful enemy or a powerful opponent to Israel, and you get a number of conflicts between them. So it's not until the 8th century that we begin to see significant archaeological remnants in Judah of a kingship, or if I can just say, a more developed political entity. And really, there it becomes more apparent after the fall of Israel in 722 to the Assyrians. Israel had rebelled against the Assyrians and ended up laying siege to Samaria and apparently destroying it, although the archaeological evidence is somewhat lacking, and then taking a lot of the Israelites off, deporting them and scattering them to the wind. So it's really after that you get significant archaeological evidence for a kingship in Judah. It doesn't mean it didn't exist prior to that. That's not what I'm trying to say. It's just that the on-the-ground evidence doesn't really begin to become more evident till after the fall of Israel. So I guess I would start with that. That's the broad overview of it.
Yeah. In general, we have lots of monuments from that period on the East Bank.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, we're not
Yes.
going to enter into daily politics and all kinds of modern history, who came first and who left first, because
Right.
we cannot make good analogies regarding the ancient history of Levant by portraying the ancient history of Levant through modern lenses and modern circumstances and people who dwell in 2025 in southern Levant or
Right.
northern Levant. This is completely ridiculous, and it's not scientifically based. But we do have monuments from Hasmonean dynasty on the East Bank, including the well-known fortress Makaber.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
According to the Bible, John the Baptist was executed there, and we still have remains of that fortress.
Mm-hmm.
There's
Yep.
a there's a port which transported goods from the West Bank to East Bank under the port.
Hmm.
Actually, Konstantinos Politis is working on that project. I don't know whether you're aware or not, but
I've been, I don't know him, but I've been there.
yeah,
It's a pretty amazing site.
yes. So, what do you think about the political influence of Kingdom of Israel and later dynasties that were Roman clients on the East Bank and territories of Ammonites and Moabites?
So, just to clarify there, you're saying what's the influence like from
Political
the
influence. Yeah,
Iron Age um, down to the Greek period,
yeah,
or that's what you're
yeah.
asking?
Greco-Roman period. I'm talking about Greco-Roman period. It's
Hmm.
700, 800 yeah, 700, 800 years
Sure. I
approximately.
mean, I think certainly. I mean, okay. Let me take a step back here. I think when you were talking briefly about um, being careful about drawing conclusions for our current times based on ancient history. Um, I'm completely on board with you as far as that's concerned, and I think we have to be careful about the connections we make from say the Iron Age down to the Hasmonean period or whatever. There certainly is an organic development of things in the area over
Yeah,
time. It's not like you get one time period is completely separate from the other time period, and I know you're not saying that. There's an organic connection between these periods, but there's also significant differences that I are within them. So as far as the Iron Age period of kingdoms in both in Israel and Judah, and then also over in Jordan, Ammon, Moab, and Edom. Right, the political institutions, as far as we can tell, the kingships that existed in the Iron Age, um, don't last past the Persian period. They are destroyed, subjugated in various ways during the Babylonian period, New Babylonian period, and then in the Persian period, Judah, Samaria, Ammon, probably also Moab and Edom, though we don't have the evidence for it, all became Persian provinces. And so their independent status it goes away, but that, of course, doesn't mean that the people went away or that the traditions that they had were completely destroyed. And so once you get, in the Persian period, there's indications in the Bible, also in the Elephantine papyri, for example, down in Egypt, that there was still native, political power in these areas. We get indication of, something like a governor in Ammon, a guy named Tobiah, and a governor up in Samaria called Sanballat. These are mentioned in the Bible, and Ezra and Nehemiah also mentioned in Sanballat, anyways, is mentioned in the Elephantine papyri. So there's ongoing political traditions there that continue then down into the Hasmonean period or Maccabean period, and it's really with the Maccabeans who are fighting against two forces. They're fighting against the Seleucids dynasty, which had followed from Alexander the Great in Syria. They're fighting against that, and then they're also fighting against their own what they saw as the Hellenized Jews, who were really no Jews at all. And so the Maccabeans are fighting for both political independence, but also for a particular religious vision that they have that they don't think their fellow Jews are following strictly enough. Over in Jordan, we do have some evidence for a province of Ammon in the Persian period, and then in the Greek period, we eventually get sites such as Amman or Philadelphia incorporated into the Decapolis system, the Greek system of 10 cities. And the Nabateans, who I'm sure most of us are aware of in terms of their connection with Petra, the Nabateans play a significant role in this period as another local power, political power in the area that is going to have encounters with the Hasmoneans and eventually down into the Roman period. So there's not a ton of archaeological evidence for the Persian period, at least not a ton of archaeological evidence that is put together well and understood well. There's probably more to be said there. Once you get to the Greek period, of course, as you said, Macarius is an important site. There are Nabatean sites running up and down Jordan, of course, all the way down to Petra, and other Greek sites. So it's an important period up in closer to Amman. You have the Tobiads that seem to have been an entrenched political force there down into second century-ish, something like that. How they're connected, whether they're connected, I think most people assume they are, but whether and how they're connected to Tobiah the Ammonite, who's mentioned in Ezra and Nehemiah, is sort of a difficult question. We don't know. We assume because their name is similar that they are connected there. And what's interesting about Tobiah the Ammonite, at least the guy who's mentioned in is a Yahwistic name. That is, it ends in with the name of the god of what we would normally consider the god of Judah and Israel. So it's interesting that he seems to have a significant role, and then his family has some significant role later. Was he Jewish or was Judean? And did his family maintain that? It's a little difficult to tell. You don't, just because you have a Yah on the end of your name doesn't necessarily mean you had to be from Judah precisely, but it is suggestive and kind of interesting.
Okay. What are similarities and differences between Kingdom of Judah and Kingdom of Israel?
Well, so similarities in the Iron Age, they seem to share a language. Not surprisingly, Hebrew, although once we get inscriptions, it's written slightly different. That is, how the scribes were trained seem to be somewhat different, mutually intelligible, but somewhat different. Right from the get-go, Israel is always the big brother and Judah is always the little brother. And that's largely connected to what I had mentioned before, easier access to the coast, better access to arable lands in the Jezreel Valley, and just generally more rainfall in the north meant that agriculture was easier to do in the north, and more connections and more conflict in the north with surrounding neighbors, especially in the 9th century with Damascus. More ready contact with the Phoenicians and maritime trade and whatnot. So really, and a lot of people think of Israel as, again, being the big brother. It's also of the two of them, it's the one that ends up getting destroyed earlier because of the rebellion against the Assyrians. Judah, on the other hand, we're talking about a smaller area. The area is, often just referred to as the highlands of Judah. It's mountainous, it's much drier, and much better for grazing animals, and you can grow stuff there too. I'm not saying you can't grow anything, but agriculturally, it's just a more difficult place to grow crops in any significant quantities. And so, and also it's kind of, if you're looking at a map there, um, at least in the Iron Age, when you have the Philistines in the earlier part of the Iron Age along the coast, Judah really doesn't have easy access to the coast unless they go south to the Beersheba Valley and then out to the coast that way.
Yeah.
So they're sort of landlocked in a way that Israel is not, and as a result, it's harder for them to get access to trade. Not impossible, but more difficult. It's also the case that because they're smaller, they don't come into contact as early as Israel does, and maybe because of their relative weakness, if I can put it that way, they're not in a position to rebel against foreign powers until after Israel's gone, and that is what happens eventually with Hezekiah and others who do rebel against the Assyrians, thinking in some cases that the Egyptians would help them. But in the really in the 7th century is when Judah kind of flourishes. Once Israel has been destroyed in 722, Judah seems to expand southward, so having sites along the Beersheba Valley and into the Shephelah, the kind of transition area between the highlands and the lowlands. And it seems that they were actively involved in olive oil production, probably wine as well, which are crops that grow in this area, but especially in the Shephelah, this is a good area that gets a fair amount of rain and is more arable.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really in that late come a thing that becomes recognizable archaeologically, but also on the international scene where you start to see kings of Judah mentioned by the kings of Assyria.
Okay. Do we have differences in customs and religious practices between Kingdom of Israel, Kingdom of Judah, Ammonite Kingdom, Moabite
Mm,
Kingdom, Edomite Kingdom?
sure. Yes, there definitely are. Um, I think maybe as I mentioned before, I like to think of them as sort of all of these Judah, Israel, as a family of religions rather than as distinct, completely separate religions. They have a family resemblance, and um, they all seem to have some kind of, a high god that is usually portrayed as a weather type god, a weather deity, at least with those images. And it's the same deity for Israel and Judah. It's
Yeah.
Yahweh. Over in Moab, Ammon, Moab, and Edom, the system seems roughly similar, except you have different high gods. In Ammon, you have Milcom. In Moab, you have Kamash. And then down in Edom, you have Kaus. So they're a separate high god. Now, there does seem to be some difference in Judah and Israel. At least as far, I mean, it's a little bit hard to tell sometimes because the way the biblical texts portray these things, but it does seem that the northern kingdom seems to have a little bit more, in some cases, Phoenician influence on the religion. You see this in some of the text with Ahab and his wife Jezebel that are seen as, incorporating Phoenician influences in a way, religious influences in a way that Judah did not. Judah, it does seem that in Judah you get what will eventually be the Yahweh alone party, if you want to put it that way. That is to
Yeah.
say, a move towards something like um, a monotheism. Whether it's strictly speaking a monotheism at the time is a little hard to say,
Yeah.
but you do see that movement towards only this one God is the one that we worship and are dedicated to. That seems a little less likely in the north. There's certainly they worship Yahweh in the north. I'm not trying to say that. It's just the extent to that unitary devotion does not seem to be there. Um, those religious influences, or excuse me, those religious differences are kind of interesting when you reflect on them from the perspective of the Elephantine papyri, which are found in Aswan in Egypt, or excuse me, on the island of Elephantine in Egypt. And in one of those papyri, it's pretty fascinating. They write to Sanballat. Now we're talking Persian period, so I'm getting a little time-wise. I'm moving ahead a little bit. But in the Persian period, they're writing to Sanballat up in Samaria in order to ask about what we think of as Jewish religious traditions, and in particular Passover. And so they're consulting with, the party that we would think of as being not Orthodox, not fully Orthodox Judean Jewish at the time, rather than only going to Jerusalem, which is kind of an interesting, and it's kind of interesting and suggests that the thing that we now call Judaism, or we would call Judaism in the, first century BC and first century AD, it had not fully crystallized into a system in the fourth century or fifth century BCE. It took a while, and it's not until you really get down again to the Maccabeans that you start to get something that is distinctly resembling what we now know as Judaism. So that gets going Persian period and later. But in any case, I think those are the main differences. There is also, and I'm sure you're aware of this, in Israel, but particularly in Judah, at least from what we have, stamp seals. So these are tiny little stones that people have engraved for using for sealing documents and whatnot. There is an interesting aniconic trend especially in Judah on those, at least from the evidence we have available. That is to say, in Ammon, more seals that have images of gods and goddesses and other things on them, along with names. But in Judah, there's this just far fewer of them. You get this kind of aniconic, that is, no icons on them. And people have often wondered whether that is connected somehow to what appears to be an aniconic ideology that appears in the Bible, especially under Josiah in the late 7th century. So there definitely are some differences. I like to think of them more as like historical progression rather than absolute, like, now we have the pure form of, Judeanism or whatever it is. It's a progression over time in response to political, social, and religious circumstances.
What happened to the kingdom of Israel after 722 BC, and what with the kingdom of Judah after 586 BC?
Yeah, at least from what we know, in 722, when Samaria falls to the Assyrians under Sargon II, we're told that they are carted off. Sargon tells us that they're carted off. The Bible also tells us that people were carted off, deported. And it seems that the Assyrian system of deportation was different than the Babylonian system of deportation. The Assyrians had more of a tendency to scatter people into various parts of their empire, and then they also they imported people from various parts of their empire into the Samaria area. This scattering to the winds led to a sort of disappearance of, not a complete disappearance, but a disappearance in the broader Assyrian sphere of those people that had been deported. They weren't settled in great enough numbers to maintain their cultural and religious identity. Now, some of them, of course, never left. The Assyrians didn't deport every single person from the Samaria area. So some of them did leave, and this becomes a argument between Judah and Israel later, where the Judeans see the Samaritans as a bastardized mix of Israelite traditions and traditions from elsewhere, right? And so not everyone left, or not everyone was forced to leave, but a significant population does seem to have been taken out by the Assyrians, and because they were scattered, did not have the cultural strength to really you know, remain for a long period of time. Judah, on the other hand, when Judah was finally destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian, at least at the time of Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian method of deporting people tended to be to bring them in mass to Babylon. And part of this seems to have to do with the need to rebuild Babylon. But as a result, people were settled in and around Babylon, and we have some documents from Babylon that make it clear that there were actually, like, what we in the United States, if you're in a big city, you might have a part of the city that you call Chinatown or whatever, where immigrants of a certain from a certain nationality or ethnicity have settled in large enough population that you get this, like, resemblance to the native country they're from. And same thing seems to have happened in Babylon. We have indication that there were areas of Babylon that had people from Phoenician cities, and including also Judah. And so they were settled in a way that allowed for enough critical mass of people to maintain their cultural identity. Some people, again, were not deported. So there were people that remained in the Judean area after Nebuchadnezzar deported kind of the elites, the priests, mostly the wealthy people and skilled craftsmen. So under the Persian period, then, when Cyrus the Great comes into power, he allows people to return to their homelands from Babylon, and some of the Jews were among them. When they get back, and not everyone left Babylon, not everyone decided to go back. They had lived there for a long time. And as a result, there ends up being a strong Jewish Babylonian remnant that stays there for hundreds of years. It's the reason why, if you're familiar with the Talmud, that the most prominent Talmud is called the Babylonian Talmud. It remains the most prominent there. So you have a significant critical mass of people that just stay in Babylon. But there's some people that go back to Judah to rebuild Judah. And what they encounter when they get there, of course, is that there were people who never left. And then you have arguments between them about what it truly means to be Judean. And that's what we're talking about at that time. And eventually that becomes Judean, kind of morphs into something more specifically religious we would eventually call Jewish. So those are the big outlines of what happened to Israel and Judah.
If you want to add something in the last 5 minutes, please go ahead.
Oh, sure. I was just going to mention, and I'd be happy to, or interested to hear what you might have to say about this. But, one of the, really lasting things that comes out of the deportation of the Israelites in 722 is the myth of the lost tribes of Israel.
Oh, yeah.
So because the Israelites are sort of scattered to the wind, you then have this, where are they, right? And so you then get this myth of, sorry, I'm getting a call here. You then get this myth of Israelites appearing all over the place, in Ireland and in China and all over the place, where people, and Ukraine and
Yeah.
everywhere, everywhere where there's supposedly parts of the lost tribes of Israel, and they somehow
Although
cleanse.
physically they don't look alike.
No, right, of course, of
Indian
course.
Indian adherents to Judaism look like Indians, and people in
Right,
Korea who follow Judaism look like Asians. They don't
right,
look
of course.
like Slavic people in Russia, Ukraine, and Poland, and also Ashkenaz don't look like Yemeni Jews.
Right. No, exactly.
So
I know it's an interesting the tribes of Israel, um, kind of lost tribes of Israel are interesting because of the fact that this I always think of it as being like the thing that is unstable or we don't know becomes the thing that everyone can build on and dump and pour in their interpretations. And
yeah,
it's because of we don't know what happened really, or they just sort of disappeared, that people can interpret their own
they
however
can
they want
fabricate
with
all kinds of things.
yes, and all sorts of and even though I don't think those are historical, they do make for some fascinating history of interpretation.
Fair enough. Thank you so much for one more conversation about Southern Levantine history and archaeology.
Yep,
And
for
we're going
sure.
to continue. We're going to continue to discuss about the Kingdom of Israel, Kingdom of Judah,
Okay,
and of course, East Bank kingdoms that we mentioned previously.
great. Look forward to it.
Thank you so much. All the
All
best.
right. Have a good one. Peace.
Peace.